13th of December, the International Center for Defense and Security, ICDS, hosted a webinar discussion with distinguished guests and panelists from different institutions on the topic of what lessons on deterrence can Estonia and Taiwan draw from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was the second webinar in a series of events that we have been carrying out with the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, IMDSR. Now, we have been focusing on lessons for deterrence because of a growing sense of crisis both in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific concerning the revisionist and aggressive foreign policy of China and Russia. These two countries have espoused a foreign policy that aims to revise international norms and international and regional status quo in their respective regions, something that has been most dramatically demonstrated in Russia's full-scale aggression of Ukraine since 2022. Because of this, both Estonia and Europe, and NATO in general, and Taiwan have been thinking about ways to enhance their security and defense by enhancing their deterrence towards Moscow and Beijing. The first webinar focused precisely on trying to understand the sources and the procedures of how China and Russia pursue their revisionist aims and foreign policy. What are the sources? What are the implications? What are the means that these two countries use to pursue their aggressive foreign policies? The second webinar has looked at the other side by focusing on the Baltic Nordic area and on Taiwan to see how countries react to the aggressive foreign policy of Russia and China and try to enhance their security by attempting to deter expanded aggression by either of these two countries. Because ultimately both Taiwan and Estonia prefer the status quo. Both countries have benefited from globalization, from regional security, from the way things are in their respective regions. These are two orders that Beijing and Moscow aim to revise. Now, this broader project aims to exchange knowledge and insights about how to deal with these larger and aggressive revisionist powers. And the discussion featured a distinguished panel of experts from Estonia and Taiwan and the United States. On the Estonian side, we had Tony Lawrence, Head of Defense Policy and Strategy Program and Research Fellow at ICDS. His research is focused on the future of NATO, NATO's Baltic Air Policing Mission, European defense policy, air defense of the three Baltic states, and maritime aspects of deterrence and defense in the Baltic region. Tony was also an assistant professor at the Baltic Defense College. Our second panelist was Eric Chan, senior non-resident fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute and air power strategist for the United States Air Force. His areas of expertise include the DPRK and the PRC military capabilities, political leadership, strategic culture, and great power competition. Eric holds a master's degree in international affairs from George Washington University. And finally, we were joined by Yunyi Li, an associate research fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, INDSR, in Taipei. His expertise covers theories of non-traditional security, hybrid threats, and gray zone conflicts, and foreign and security policies of small states. Yun Yi holds a PhD in international relations from the University of East Anglia. I myself moderated the discussion. I am Ivan Klyszcz, research fellow at ICDS, and each speaker spoke for about 10 to 15 minutes, presenting their main ideas concerning the subject, and the conversation was followed by a moderated discussion and question and answers from the audience. The discussion broadly touched topics of the limits of hybrid warfare as waged by Beijing and Moscow, and the intentions behind this hybrid warfare, notably to break the resistance and the will to fight of the countries and regions targeted by these aggressive means. The conversation also spoke about the role of alliances, but also of cooperation, of industries and capabilities, and social cohesion. So the conversation went into what goes to create successful deterrence. And concepts such as broad-based social rules of deterrence were addressed as well. The lessons that we drew were varied, such as the importance of reinforcing deterrence to maintain a will to fight if fighting is needed. We also spoke about the strategy of ambiguity regarding Taiwan's status, and we concluded by stressing the need to take seriously the foreign policy of revisionist states. We focused on Beijing and Russia, China and Russia, but this applies to many other countries as well. It was overall a very rich conversation. Very substantial points were exchanged concerning deterrence in our respective regions, and I invite you to listen to it and draw your own perspectives and points from it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ivan, and thanks for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to take part this afternoon. I'm going to speak a little more broadly than the title of this webinar suggests. I'm going to talk about the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on deterrence policies and postures in the wider context of the Nordic-Baltic region, not just in Estonia. But before I get into the detail, I'd like to sort of start with a couple of framing remarks. And the first of those would be that the states in this region had, by and large, understood the threat posed by Russia. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was certainly a shock. I mean, its brutality, its scale. But the states of this region have long understood the importance of deterring Russia through appropriate military preparedness. So Russia's war didn't fundamentally challenge basic ideas about the threat and the need for deterrence, as it perhaps did in other European states, so for example, Germany. But it did lead to a reconsideration of how deterrence should be implemented in several ways. And then the second kind of framing remark would be that Ukraine is a very different case from the states of the Nordic-Baltic region. And the most obvious difference in security terms is that military security in this region is guaranteed by NATO, and in particular by NATO's Article 5, which is not, of course, the case for Ukraine. It also wasn't the case for Finland and Sweden. And the challenge that Russia's war posed to their assumptions about security led to one of the biggest reassessments of security, defence and deterrence policy in our region. And of course, the applications to join NATO that then followed that. But I think the key point is that NATO's membership is fundamental to deterrence in our region. And it's quite difficult and actually often quite not particularly meaningful to separate national deterrence efforts from alliance deterrence efforts. So I'm going to try and give a short overview of some aspects of what has been done so far, and I'm going to frame my remarks by reference to the 3Cs model of deterrence. So that's capability, credibility, and communication. Capability, of course, the forces that we have to respond to an attack, to impose costs, to deny an adversary's objectives. Credibility being the extent to which an adversary might believe our intent and resolve of a military response, and communication concerning the signalling to an adversary of the capability and will to respond. I'm only going to concern myself with the military aspects of deterrence, although of course deterrence can involve a whole range of instruments, diplomacy, sanctions, for example. But I think there's a broad and fairly strong consensus that Russia is most effectively deterred by military force. And I'm also going to concern myself only with deterrence as it relates to full-scale military aggression and not, for example, with hybrid attacks. So let me start with the first C, which is capability. I mean, and it's clear that there's been a great deal of effort across the states of this region to modernize and to expand their armed forces. And some of that has been going on for quite a long time, certainly at least since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. But the full-scale invasion in 2022 gave a great deal of impetus to that process. If you look at NATO's defence spending figures, defence expenditure in Latvia in 2023 will be about 13% higher than it was in 2021. Estonia and Lithuania, the increase will be 30%, 30%, and in Finland, almost 80%. Those are constant price comparisons. Those increases reflect a trend across the whole of NATO, but not all of the allies have been quite as enthusiastic as have those on the eastern flank. So the average growth across NATO has been about 10% in those 2 years. In terms of how that money is spent, I would say that Russia's war hasn't particularly fundamentally challenged the ideas about the type of armed forces that a state needs in order to have defence and deterrence. There've been no game-changing capabilities or technologies that have been seen in the war, and the need still seems to be for a kind of balanced range of capabilities. But the war has certainly confirmed that if your adversary is Russia, then certain qualities remain important, and notably, I'm talking about mass, I'm talking about heaviness, so armour and artillery, and I'm talking about sustainability. So in terms of mass, most states across the region have revised their conscription policies and their reserve structures. The 3 Baltic states have started to build divisional level structures to replace the current brigade level formations. Heaviness has been reflected in recent acquisitions. So the 3 Baltic states, for example, have all purchased HIMARS rocket artillery systems from the states. And in terms of sustainability, the war has gone on for much longer than most of us expected it would do. Rates of ammunition usage have been huge, and in particular, that concerns artillery ammunition. And that's also been reflected in acquisition programs in the region. So to take Estonia as an example, Estonia has recently announced its intention to buy about €500 million worth of ammunition in the next 7 years. And to put that into some context, €500 million is about half of an annual defence budget for Estonia. To turn to the second C, which is credibility. When it's one thing, of course, to possess military capability, it's another for your adversary to believe that you will use it and carry out the response that you threaten to any provocation. Credibility comes from a number of things, but I just want to bring out a couple of examples from the Nordic Baltic region that have occurred in response to Russia's war. The first of those relates to the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, and the second to an argument that the Baltic states have put forward for a pretty substantial shift in NATO's defence concept for this region. So Finland and Sweden, I mean, this of course is about the credibility that comes from being part of an alliance. And Finland, I think, is the more interesting case of the two. Finland's decision to apply for NATO was very much driven from the bottom up. So the population that had previously been, quite against joining NATO, so 30-40% sort of level of support, changed its views very quickly and very substantially. So, rising close to 80% before the application in the space of a few months. So the government didn't make the case for membership to the population, it was the other way around. But in rationalising it later, Finnish analysts have explained that Finland is not sure that on its own it can deter Russia. So it's quietly confident that it has the ability to defend against Russia, but not to deter. So the main rationale for Finland's NATO accession is to enhance its deterrence, and including through the nuclear component of NATO's deterrence posture, but not so much for defence, where Finland intends to carry on much as it has done before. And I think it's quite unusual to see these two concepts, defence and deterrence, sort of so clearly disconnected. I mean, it's more usually the case that preparations for a strong defence, are thought to provide also deterrence. And one of the reasons why that might not be the case in Finland is because Finland has perhaps been missing this third C of deterrence because of the unusual geostrategic circumstances it's occupied for the last few decades. And that third C being communication, and I'll briefly come back to that in a moment. But before I do, I mean, the second aspect of credibility that I'd like to talk about is proximity. So the idea here is that a military force is a more credible deterrent the closer it is to the location of a potential confrontation. So from 2017, and in response to Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine, so Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, NATO put in place a revised deterrent posture that involved 4 battalion-sized deployments in the Baltic states and Poland that would, in the event of attack, act as a tripwire and trigger a larger scale NATO reinforcement of the region to restore territorial integrity. So essentially, that's a deterrence by punishment concept. And after NATO's full-scale, so after Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, The Baltic states essentially kind of rejected that concept, and they argued, with reference to the atrocities that Russian forces were prosecuting in Ukraine, that it was simply unacceptable for a NATO state to be partly occupied by an invading force, and that deterrence in punishment should instead be replaced by deterrence by denial, or what the Baltic states call forward defence. And that term, forward defence, captures this very idea of proximity. And essentially what it meant the Baltic states were looking for was a greater Allied presence on their territories. I would argue that that's been partly, but not wholly implemented. We certainly have more enablers in theatre. Notably at the Vilnius summit, NATO agreed to put a scheme in place whereby air defence assets were rotationally present in the Baltic states, for example. There are more US and NATO forces in the region, but NATO as a whole has not really signed up to this concept of forward defence as the Baltic states see it. If you look at NATO official declarations, they sort of fudge this a little bit and talk about forward defences, but not forward defence as a concept. And that means that defence and therefore deterrence in this region still largely relies on reinforcement by NATO. And because that entails more decision points, you might argue that that's a kind of a lesser form of deterrence posture. Against this, I would say that Russia's hope or expectations of the rest of NATO abandoning its Baltic allies in the event of a conflict in this region have really been undermined by the unity and cohesion that NATO has shown in its response to Russia's full-scale war. And ultimately, I think that united response, which clearly took Russia by surprise, and with this real-world evidence of NATO's cohesion, NATO's determination to defend all of its members, is probably the biggest contribution that's been made to the credibility of NATO's deterrence posture in this region. Let me turn briefly to the third C, which is communication. I don't intend to say very much here. The longer standing allies in the region, so Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, have always been pretty robust in their rhetoric towards Russia, to the point sometimes of upsetting the other allies who've considered Baltic rhetoric in the past to be somewhat provocative. But since the full-scale invasion, NATO has, I think, also been very strong as regards communication. There's some pretty strong, tough words in the, for example, the Vilnius Summit Declaration directed towards Russia. This idea of defending every inch of NATO territory, which I think was first used by Jens Stoltenberg, has become a kind of common currency of NATO language. Maybe one kind of interesting aspect to note here, again concerning Finland. Finland has been used for decades, and for good reasons, again, because of its rather unusual geopolitical position, to be pretty cautious in its rhetoric towards Russia. But as I noted earlier, Finland has joined NATO principally to enhance its own deterrence, and will need, if that deterrence is to be credible, to also break its long-standing habits of cautious communication and to communicate more strongly deterrent signals towards Russia. So I'm going to finish at that point. I mean, just perhaps to sum up, I think I would argue that Russia's war in Ukraine has not brought any fundamental lessons about the nature and practice and deterrence to this region, but it's certainly persuaded states here to take steps to enhance their deterrence through increasing capability and through taking measures to strengthen credibility. And it's underlying the importance of communicating deterrence messages. So thank you, Johan. I will finish there.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you for this overview and quite depthful and insightful overview of the security and defense situation in the Nordic Baltic region. Let me turn next to Eric Chan. Eric, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I want to first thank Tony for an excellent discussion on the 3 Cs. That dovetails in perfectly into my discussion here regarding deterrence through all of society defense readiness. So both Taiwan and Estonia face continual course of pressure and threat of armed invasion from significantly larger adversaries. And moreover, these adversaries are authoritarian states with war powers are concentrated in a dictatorial leader. So to deter the state, one must deter the leader, right? So it is important to note that in both cases, neither of these leaders are military men, although they're occasionally advised, and I use that word lightly, by their militaries. So strictly military deterrence is critical, but insufficient as a form of deterrence. This is even more true given the relatively small territories of Taiwan and Estonia, which reduce but do not eliminate the ability for both of these states to conduct a defense in depth. Instead, when we talk about defense in depth, we have to really look at this not as a matter of land, but really as a matter of people. The will and the ability to resist armed force must be first, whole society, and two, demonstrably and visibly credible in different aspects of warfighting and resistance. And these lessons in deterrence have been borne out by the invasion of Ukraine. This is a world where perception creates its own reality, and thus there is a danger that if the adversary perceives that you are just relying on your military for deterrence, then that is a serious gap in the ability for any state to deter the adversary. We really have to look at the ability for both military as well as civil society to provide separate but equal forms of deterrence and resistance. So now I'm going to look at three specific cases from the war in Ukraine, and I mean this as a broader war starting from 2014, and this really demonstrates the value of this type of all-society defense readiness. So first case is the Russian seizure of Crimea in February of 2014, and this is really a prime demonstration of the value of actually a case where there was no societal deterrence as well as no military deterrence. Right. In 2014, the Ukrainian military was, to quote their own generals, an army literally in ruins. Political polarization of society is largely based on regional and linguistic lines, notably in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. While this polarization did not and does not equate to a desire to secede from Ukraine and unite with Russia, it certainly contributed to Putin's overwhelming contempt for Ukraine as, quote, not a real country. So in the capital city of Kyiv, the Maidan revolution had just succeeded in late February. Pro-Russian President Yanukovych had just fled the country, leaving interim President Turchinov in charge. Putin's primary fear at this point came from the potential Western response, and he got around this by utilizing hybrid war, or what we would now call gray zone warfare. This involved the use of the now infamous little green men of Russian Spetsnaz to seize a Crimean parliament, ports, and airports. And against any prepared and competent military or even a paramilitary, these lightly armed forces should have been easily detected and destroyed. Unfortunately, this does not exist at the time. As stated, the Ukrainian military was in a complete state of disrepair, while the security services of Ukraine was badly infiltrated by Russian agents, and until the Maidan revolution, was largely a tool of political repression by Yanukovych. In Crimea, this was absolutely fatal. So within a week of the lightly armed green men and associated armed protesters seizing the Crimean parliament, Russian forces had moved in from Sevastopol. The Ukrainian military was completely paralyzed, with thousands of troops besieged and later with their bases stormed by these protesters. Even more concerning, without a clear chain of command and orders from Kyiv, these soldiers didn't offer armed resistance to the enemy. It was pretty clear that there weren't rules of engagement, and there were a serious lack of direct orders, and that communications had been cut off from Kyiv. Just as critically, there was a lack of societal defense. That doesn't mean that there wasn't any social resistance to the Russians. In both late February and in early March, Crimeans protested strongly against Russian interference. Some 15,000 people attended the March 8 protest. But because there is no integrated state support for this resistance, and the resistance itself was episodic and disorganized and unarmed, this inability meant that the Crimeans could not provide even a token resistance to allow Putin to play his game of plausible deniability. In contrast, the pro-Russian protests were planned, organized, and funded by the Russian Federal Security Service, or the FSB. This was done on a set timeline to achieve political as well as morale effects. The pro-Russian protesters are armed on the basis of so-called self-defense regiments, which worked both as a point of infiltration and as a mask for Russian military activity. Eastern Ukraine's turn was next. FSB-controlled separatists declared the announcement of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic in April 2014. This was accompanied by largely the same FSB playbook used in Crimea, with FSB driving protests and disturbances across eastern Ukraine. Cutouts such as Igor Girkin led armed squads to drive the perception of instability while maintaining deniability for the Kremlin. However, the Ukrainian response was different this time. It was more organized, and this leads to my second case. Here, we also see little to no military deterrence, but now we also see some aspects of societal defense. On 15 April, in response to separatists overrunning the city of Slovyansk in Donetsk, the Ukrainian interim president announced the start of an anti-terrorist operation. This lasted for all of 4 days, in which time the Ukrainian forces took back a grand total of 1 airfield that was seized by the separatists. The Ukrainian military was estimated to only be able to deploy some 6,000 troops out of a paper force of 130,000, despite mobilization having begun in March and conscription being reintroduced in May. So by May, it was pretty clear that the military was simply not capable of providing armed resistance to the separatists. Instead, thousands of Ukrainians flocked to volunteer battalions, and civil society provided donations and contributions to arm and equip these volunteer battalions. The Ukrainian summer offensive from May to July 2014 was powered by this combination of eager volunteer battalions and the slowly filling in ranks of the regular military. And against the FSB insurgents numbering the low hundreds, this was sufficient. Russian attempts to deniably provide the insurgents with armor and artillery was insufficient given the scale of the fighting. By the end of July, the Ukrainians were clearly on the verge of crushing the separatists. Unfortunately, the Russian military then intervened in mass in August, and then most infamously at the Battle of Ilovaisk. 8 Russian battalion tactical groups with artillery support and armor encircled the Ukrainians fighting there. And then Putin offered a humanitarian corridor for the encircled Ukrainian volunteer battalions. Then he proceeded to kill hundreds of the retreating Ukrainians. So volunteer battalions, however enthusiastic, simply couldn't match the firepower, the training, and the organization of regular military units. What was useful here, though, for the Ukrainians was that because they forced the Russians to commit significant numbers of soldiers and equipment, Putin was forced to confront the limitations of the gray zone warfare approach. Open warfare would be needed to drastically push the Ukrainians out of eastern Ukraine, and Putin was not ready for that confrontation yet. The resulting ceasefires, which were all rapidly broken by the Russians, although without significant result, was an acknowledgement that Russia was partially deterred. That leads me to my third case, the full-scale invasion in February 2022. Now the military had deterrent value, but societal defense in this case was lacking. In the years between 2014 and 2022, the Ukrainian military underwent a full-scale reform. Conscription allowed the undermanned military to fill its ranks. Engagement with NATO gave select Ukrainian units exposure to Western tactics. And then a combination of vastly increased state spending, as well as civil society assistance, provided the resources for the military to be equipped with far more modern and plentiful weapons. And so by 2022, it was clear that Putin's reliance on gray zone warfare would no longer work against this type of revived Ukrainian military, so that any further Russian gains would need to involve direct and significant Russian military input. Conversely, the Ukrainian volunteer battalions were largely disbanded and withered away. It wasn't until July of 2021 that Ukraine began the reorganization and expansion of its territorial defense forces as a military reserve force. And part of this had to deal with the fact that in that period, the volunteer battalions competed with the regular military for funding, and it wouldn't be accountable and controllable. But unfortunately, because of the very late activation of the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Force, we had the media pictures of civilians practicing with cardboard rifles. And this type of thing just really didn't provide a good deterrent effect for Putin, right? And the hasty mobilization after the invasion was also luckily not a catastrophe, simply because the Russians didn't have the ability to rapidly identify and target the mass groupings of civilian volunteers in Kyiv. If they had that ability, it would have been a mass casualty event. So from a deterrence perspective, the TDF and other forms of civil resistance wasn't even considered by Putin. Putin's speech in February 2022 announcing his invasion offered amnesty for the military personnel of the Ukrainian army to lay down arms and go home. So, and the entire premise of the special military operation was to paralyze and fix the professional Ukrainian military in place at the joint force operation area in eastern Ukraine. So any other resistance would be overall through speed and presence. In short, it was designed as an FSB operation. So we all know what happened next. Putin's underestimation of the Ukrainian will to fight led to a strategic and operational disaster for the initial Russian campaign. Unfortunately, Russia isn't defeated just yet. So it's well worth considering the possibility that had Putin been fully aware that his military would face a well-equipped, well-trained, and numerous territorial defense force, he would have instead been forced to just grit his teeth and continue reliance on gray zone warfare tactics instead of an all-out invasion. So these case studies point to me some prime lessons for all society defense readiness. The first lesson is decisive and unified leadership messaging matters. In Crimea, the defense was paralyzed because no one knew who was in charge. In the second case of Eastern Ukraine in 2014, there was finally some leadership messaging, but this couldn't be credibly backed up with immediate military force. Finally, prior to the outbreak of war in 2022, Zelensky's efforts to prevent economic panic caused a very visible split between Ukraine and the US at a crucial moment. Second, protraction of warfare is key to survival for small states. In Eastern Ukraine, the attempt by volunteer battalions to rapidly finish the war, despite the knowledge of impending Russian intervention, was catastrophic. This goes against both a basic military desire for decisive action, as well as societal wishes for a quick resolution to any conflict. But survival and deterrence for small states means visible preparation for a long war. Third, a well-prepared civil defense must be separate from the regular military structure to provide its own deterrence. There's always some temptation to treat a territorial defense force as a pool of reservists for attrition warfare, and ultimately that became the fate of the TDF in Ukraine. However, as a tool of strategic deterrence, a separate decentralized civil defense force is difficult for an enemy to target. They cannot assume paralysis of leadership will lead to a rapid organizational collapse. This is a population as defense in death. These lessons will drastically raise the cost for any aggressor, with a point that they cannot count on an easy or short victory. This, in turn, means that any aggression that they wish to conduct will need long, visible preparation, further making it more difficult for any attacker to gain the element of surprise. For small states, deterrence has to be a whole society effort. And these conclude my remarks.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for not only this outlook on how hollow defense deterrence and also very concrete lessons drawing from Ukraine for small states. So very on target with our webinar's theme. So now for last but not least, for our introductory remarks before our moderated discussion, I would pass the word to Jinyi. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ivan, for having me here. On my part, I was assigned to discuss what Taiwan can learn from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to deter China. And I think much has been explored with respect to what Taiwan can learn from Ukraine. In contrast, China's view of the war seems to receive less attention, but this is also important for us to think about deterrence. So I would therefore like to begin my intervention by exploring how China sees the war. As we know that the Chinese government rejects the comparison between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the cross-strait relations. So there is little or basically none official information about what the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP learned from the war. I therefore did a preliminary survey on China National Knowledge Infrastructure, or CNKI, which is one of China's largest academic databases. In my survey, there is no article directly discussing how the war in Ukraine teaches China if it considers unifying Taiwan by force either. One of my findings, however, is that quite a few Chinese scholars take a perspective of hybrid warfare to understand Russia's action against Ukraine since 2014, as well as the West's responses to Russia's invasion since February 2022. Here, I think Chinese scholars' use of hybrid warfare goes beyond the mainstream understanding of the term and incorporates the PLA doctrine of three warfares, that is, public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. So it is usually claimed that Russia deployed a variety of measures, including political, information, cyber, public opinion, psychological, diplomatic, legal, proxy, and military and economic warfare to successfully annex Crimea. These measures have also been taken in Russia's special military operation since February 2022. However, according to those Chinese scholars, given that the US and the West have also learned the lessons of hybrid warfare, Russia hasn't been able to achieve its objective in Ukraine so far. The US and the West's hybrid warfare tools include intelligence and military support for Ukraine, information warfare that marginalizes Russia's perspective and narrative, and financial and economic sanctions on Russia. It is worth noting that information or public opinion warfare stands out as a topic that attracts many Chinese scholars. Another finding is that Chinese scholars seem to accept hybrid warfare as the form future wars will take. One even argued that the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy has evolved into a whole of the government strategic competition against China, and hence is a variant of hybrid warfare. Now, what does that mean for possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Does Chinese scholars' use of the hybrid warfare concept matter at all? I would suggest that the hybrid warfare concept not only reflects scholarly interest in China, but is also an extension of Chinese strategic thinking. The PLS three warfares emphasize the use of different information-related and non-kinetic operations to break adversary resistance and achieve China's objectives with little or no actual fighting. They function to shape the adversary's perception and mindset and have much in common with the hybrid warfare concept. In a way, we may say that hybrid warfare is three warfares writ large, and quite a few analysts have seen the three warfares as a proxy for explaining Chinese hybrid warfare. So here I would like to draw three implications. First, if there is a cross-strait contingency, the conflict is very likely to be hybrid. This includes, for example, a legal campaign in the United Nations that selectively emphasizes the principle of state sovereignty and non-intervention, a public opinion campaign domestically and internationally to point the finger at Taiwan for altering the status quo or refusing to negotiate with China. A psychological campaign internationally that propagates the strength of the PLA and the severe casualties the US and its partners and allies will suffer if they attempt to intervene. A cyber campaign that targets at Taiwan's and the US critical infrastructure, a diplomatic campaign that tries to rally third world or developing countries to support China's course of action while prevent consensus from making at major international forums, and a political campaign that seeks to co-opt some groups or sectors within Taiwan, and so on. So the second implication is that deterrence then becomes more expensive. Taiwan and its like-minded partners not only have to deter China from launching military operations, but also need to confront China's political warfare in all fronts. I'll come back to that later. Now, I think we may also consider Peter Marty's argument. In 2018, he suggested that the PLA is the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's army, and therefore its purpose is to create political power for the party. In other words, the PLA's function is not necessarily fighting and winning wars, although this is certainly important. In addition to war fighting, the PLA also functions to construct an environment conducive for the CCP to achieve its political goals. The three warfares, therefore, quote, are not just a feature of the PLA doing what the militaries do to prepare the battlefield. They are expressions of the CCP's intentions and day-to-day operations, unquote. So I think Marty's view echoes Chinese strategic thinking, where the purpose of strategic deterrence, that includes both deterrence and compellence, is to seek a favorable circumstances or momentum. In the context of US-China-Taiwan relations, for instance, the PLA could be used to shape an impression that it can at least inflict significant damage and cause huge losses to the US and Taiwanese army. Together with other means such as information and psychological warfare, Taiwan, the US government, and the public may come to accept that countering China militarily is ultimately futile, and that it is better to negotiate with China politically. So in this scenario, even if the conditions of deterring China are met, namely the CCP calculates that the US still enjoys military edge and accepts that the US has the resolve to intervene, it may still be willing to launch military operations in the Taiwan Strait. So China becomes more difficult to be deterred. So I think my discussion above suggests that if and when China sees future wars to be hybrid, then traditional deterrence remains necessary, but perhaps is insufficient. Modern deterrence involves confronting China in various fronts: political, social, information, psychological, and so on. And constituting a circumstance or momentum unfavorable to China is also important. So with respect to the lessons for Taiwan, I think the focus should be deterrence by denial. The priority is placed on preventing the CCP to think an outright invasion will be easy and quick. Then, as China has already posed various threats to Taiwan, Taiwan has also to engage in those hybrid threats or gray zone activities. So the tasks for Taiwan are manifold. This includes investing in asymmetric capabilities to hinder possible Chinese invasion, conducting defense reforms such as extending the term for conscription from 4 months back to 1 year, and training the reservists longer and harder, increasing social resilience in the face of Chinese economic coercion, disinformation campaign, and the United Front work, and moving towards territorial defense and urban warfare to increase the depth in defense, among others. These measures are ongoing, and some of them will take many, many years to be effective. But I think the goal is at least to complicate the CCP's calculation. And as for the role of partners, again, the priority is deterrence by denial. And we would like to urge those willing and capable partners to show a will to use force or a will to intervene and to support Taiwan militarily. On the contrary, in my view, deterrence by punishment is not likely to work. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows, dictators do not care about diplomatic isolation and economic sanctions. Moreover, if it is accepted that the POA may be used as part of China's effort to dissuade the US and others from intervention, then the punishments are not even a consideration for the CCP. And in addition, I would also propose an extension of the logic of cross-domain deterrence. The term cross-domain deterrence refers to deterring the opponent's attack in one operational domain by threatening to attack it in another operation domain. But this can be applied to political, economic, and social domains as well. So for instance, in facing China's military coercion, Taiwan can only be defensive. But with international support and good communications with China, Taiwan's partners can send a signal to China that military coercion will only lead to greater international support for Taiwan, whether domestically and or economically. And finally, bear in mind that creating a favorable circumstances or momentum is important for China. Taiwan and its partners could also work on can also work on creating a circumstance or a situation that is not in China's favor. And Taiwan and its partners can also try to exploit the CCP's vulnerabilities, such as its human rights issues, such as the legitimacy of the CCP, as well as to pushing back China's excessive claims and actions, whether in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating presentation of all the strategic circumstances around the nature of China's threat towards Taiwan at this stage, and the hybrid nature of it, and its kind of differences and similarities with Russia, and what we have prepared for, and what is what trends and trajectory we have at hand. So now we're going to enter the moderated stage of our discussion. I prepared many questions for our panelists. I will ask those, but I also encourage our attendees to think of questions they would like to ask to any one of the presenters or the panel in general. And I also invite our panelists to ask questions if you have any yourself. So just to get us started, I have a question, perhaps a rather topical one, because it's one that is kind of dominating a bit the discussions when it comes to Ukraine nowadays, which is about the defense industry and the availability of ammunition, stocks, and also when it comes to a qualitative difference, when a qualitative upgrade, let's say, of Ukrainian forces. I should mention that I'm neither an expert on deterrence nor on the Indo-Pacific, so I'm perhaps well positioned to make the type of naive questions that prompt rich discussion. So kind of we've spoken about partners, alliances, kind of the role of the role of society, and I want to ask if each of you could share your thoughts about the role of industry as well, the role of the defense industry. And this has to do also with the cost of deterrence and elements such as urban warfare and the changing nature of deterrence and of hybrid threats as well. How the industry can play a role there too. So maybe could we start with Tony as well?
Sure. I mean, to start with, a kind of very obvious point is that the defense industry is absolutely essential, because we, in Europe at least, don't produce things on a state basis anymore. We rely on private companies in the defense business. And we've clearly, over the last 20 years or so, allowed those companies to decline because we haven't been putting orders in, because our own forces have been focused much more on expeditionary warfare in the kind of post-Cold War period than they have on collective defence or national defence, which has now sort of reared its ugly head again on the world stage. So we need to ramp up the defence industry much more than currently exists. I think we're doing reasonably well. Europe will probably have quadrupled its capacity for producing 155mm ammunition by May of next year, from about 250,000 rounds a year to about 1 million. Unfortunately, we made this rather ambitious target of supplying Ukraine with 1 million rounds in a year, and because the capacity wasn't there to do that, we won't make that target. We'll have the capacity to produce 1 million a year by May, but that's not, of course, backdated to allow us to produce the million we promised Ukraine in that timeline. Here, I think probably, I mean, in Europe again, there's a role for the EU in terms of regulation, in terms of collaborative procurements, and it's part of this kind of evolving strategic picture in which, you know, we look to NATO to do collective defence, and we look to the EU to do much more of capacity building or assisting capacity building for the member states to contribute to NATO, and of course to the EU's kind of less ambitious defence targets.
I'll provide some thoughts here. It's interesting to see how differing ways of warfare have all come to the same conclusion regarding mass, right? What we've seen with this whole discussion about 155mm, for instance, is just how critical a U.S. air power is to the Western way of warfare, really, by, you know, our definition, by NATO's, you know, standard definition, right? And even there, with U.S. air power, right, the U.S. Air Force also faces the same issues with, you know, lack of munitions, with the need for more and more. So it turns out that irrespective of your way of warfare, there is a certain critical mass that is needed across all these different domains. And it's been very clear from this war that, you know, either through the Ukrainian way of war or the Russian way of war or the, you know, US and NATO way of war, whatever we have is insufficient to need. So in the buildup for just 155mm, I'd also say it's important for states to consider, you know, their munition stockpile across all of the domains, right? And then in Taiwan's case, also ensuring that their Air Force has, you know, the supplies needed, that their army has the supplies needed, because I think we're going to rapidly see the exact same munitions issue pop up across every single domain in a Pacific war, even though the way of warfare will be completely different from what we see in Ukraine.
And you?
Yes, I think one lesson from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the importance of ammunition. And this is pretty much a new issue for Taiwan. I think in this regard, we don't have a good solution to that because Taiwan is an island. So this geographic settings makes it more difficult to China to launch a full scale of invasion. But on the other hand, once there is a war, we must assume that Taiwan is pretty much blockade under Chinese blockade, and so it is even more difficult for us to receive international support. So to address this issue, I think the Taiwanese government in recent years has been investing in our own defense, in our indigenous defense industry. But it remains questionable as to whether our own defense industries can be self-sufficient. And another solution is to cooperate with the US. So the US has been floating the idea that it may build some, storage in Taiwan, So to put those ammunitions in advance. So in case there's a war, then we will have more ammunitions to use. But I think this is a complicated issue. It is highly sensitive, and it also involves some legal issues. So all I can say is that it is ongoing, but we don't know whether this is a viable option.
Can I maybe just add, this is bouncing off what Eric and you have both just said. This is the kind of, again, it's a proximity argument. You know, it's not just important that we have the ammunition, but it's important where it is. And this is why the Baltic states have pushed for pre-positioning of equipment in the region, rather than having it back in Poland or whatever. And then, of course, you have to kind of weigh up this, you know, vulnerability of having this as a target against the extra deterrence effect that you have by having it in place where it's needed. And just a small point.
Thank you for that. I find it very fascinating how not only each of us are coming from very different perspectives on similar topics, and yet there are these topics and these points that keep coming up about will to fight and having the kind of anticipating precisely the challenges that can be presented in a major contingency. I again reiterate the invitation for our attendees to ask questions while kind of still using my role as moderator to ask. I want to ask one thing that Estonia and kind of the Nordic Baltic region shares with Taiwan is the role of the US as our biggest kind of in terms of population and of economy, our biggest partner. What is your perspective about how the relationship with the US in relation to deterrence is going to evolve in the next few years? In Europe, there's I don't want to kind of preempt what Tony might want to share, but from my perspective, kind of there is a bit of hesitation and concern about what's the long-term future of US commitment to European security. Though, of course, there's confidence about NATO, there's confidence about kind of this treaty alliance, but on the level of the rhetoric and the political scenarios, there has been space for concern at the same time. So I would like to ask for your perspective on that. And let us start again with Tony.
So you just preempted what I was about to say. So, I mean, the kind of the obvious point is that the role of the US is indispensable at the moment. I said in my opening remarks that there's a broad consensus that the thing that deters Russia most is military force, and there's also a broad consensus that, you know, what deters Russia most as regards military force is American military force, American boots on the ground, American presence. But you know, we have to think in the longer term that maybe we can't rely too heavily on this anymore. I mean, even today, when you look at the States, there's a large contingency of Americans who believe that the Indo-Pacific is where the focus should be, and including the military focus. There's also a large contingent of Americans who are isolationists or America firsters, you know, and most obviously represented by Donald Trump, who has at least a chance, and not necessarily a slim chance of becoming president again next year. And this, of course, argues for the thing that we have been arguing for decades, which is that Europe needs to do more for itself. I'd like to think that at the Washington summit next year, we can see some kind of commitment from Europeans to take a larger share of the security burden for our own continent. I mean, this is, you know, it's our own defense we're talking about here. But at the moment, yeah, I mean, we do rely very heavily on America.
Eric, may I hand over to you?
Yeah, so as the resident American here, it's interesting for me to see how we've seen some, I'd say, enhanced risk-taking that you know, Europe has been able to provide in terms of the Ukraine conflict. To see the UK especially leaning forward, and you know, also with the provision of, say, like the storm shadows, and the French with the Scalpi G. There's certainly room for Europe to help provide that enhanced deterrence irrespective of American efforts. And I would say that from an American point of view, a harder edged Europe that can provide that separate conversation, that can provide a separate stream of deterrence will actually help the American conversation in terms of when and how much to intervene. Right. If the Europeans are too, isolationist on their own continent, then that makes it very difficult for any American president to, provide the justification on why U.S. blood and treasure should be expended in a conflict far away. So that would also apply to the Pacific as well, right? So increased avenues of deterrence, irrespective of American policy, will help American intervention if the need arises in the future.
Benji?
Yes, I think Taiwan also relies heavily on the U.S. Well, I think the truth is that we can only count on the U.S. as the most important security provider. But I think in terms of political relations, Taiwan so far doesn't worry too much about U.S. security commitment to Taiwan, even if Donald Trump becomes the next president. I think this is because China has become very much the only consensus both political parties have, and also Taiwan and together with other regional hotspots are a matter of U.S. or American interest in the region. So I think the stakes are simply too high for the U.S. to abandon any one of these hot spots. I do concern about the debate on strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity. For decades, the U.S. government maintains a stance of strategic ambiguity. The purpose of doing so is to create uncertainty so that China is not sure about whether the U.S. will intervene or not. And so China will be more careful. But I think, again, from my survey of those Chinese scholars' articles, I think there's a sense that if the U.S., the disparity of military strengths between the U.S. and China is getting closer, then strategic ambiguity probably doesn't mean anything. So I came across an author who used simulations conducted by U.S. think tanks to suggest that the U.S. is losing its military advantages in the Western Pacific. And so I think if it is further used as a state propaganda, then I think the U.S. continuation of the strategic ambiguity would only mean for China as weakness, as an unwillingness to commit to its partners and allies in the region. So I do think in the future, the debate on strategic ambiguity and clarity has to be reviewed and reworked. And again, I think another issue is about the partners and allies. We know that the Biden administration emphasis very much on partners and allies, but at times, we are also concerned that whether the role of partners and allies can be used as an excuse for buck passing. That is, that the U.S. government tries to emphasize that peace and security in the Indo-Pacific is a common good. So partners and allies should have their contributions. But what if the partners and allies do not or cannot contribute? will this give the U.S. government an excuse to withdraw from involving in the region? I think, judging from the current political atmosphere, it is not likely, but it remains a possibility. And so I think, again, communication not only between the US and China, but also the US and its partners and allies is quite important.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have received a couple of questions. I will just read them as they have been sent. The first one is by Agurt. Do you think that China's approach towards Taiwan could change if the ruling Democratic Progressive Party loses its presidential seat during the January's election and, say, apologies for my pronunciation, Hou Yu-yi is elected the next president of Taiwan with Zhou Shou-kong as his running mate? Or do you think the presidential and legislative Yuan elections won't have much effect on China and it will keep its hostile approach towards Taiwan either way? It's not addressed to any particular panelists, so I just invite any of you to respond or react to this question in any way.
Well, I think I should take this question first. I think in the short term, China will respond differently to Taiwan's election outcomes. In January 13th next year, Taiwan will hold a presidential election and a legislature election. And the new legislature will be there by the end of next January, while the new president will only assume his office in May the 20th. So there's a gap, a 3-month gap. Now, we don't think that China will pose a great military threat to Taiwan before the election. It would rather wait until the election outcomes are revealed. Now, if the opposition party wins the presidency and the legislature, I think, in my own view, China will wait and see if the new administration is willing to improve Taiwan's relations with China, or even to enter political negotiation with China. But I think this period will be quite short. So after 2 or 3 months, especially after the inauguration of the president, if there's no goodwill shown to the Chinese government, then I think, again, China will push Taiwan by all kinds of means. So I think this is to say that if the KMT or the main opposition party wins the presidency, China will take a wait and see approach. So there may be some mild threats or some sort of reversible coercive actions, such as putting some economic restrictive measures temporarily, and then lift those restrictive measures after the new president shows some goodwill. It is an entirely different case if the ruling party, the DPP, wins both the presidency and the legislature, because then it is this election outcome would definitely be interpreted as demonstrating the will of the Taiwanese people to maintain our way of life, to maintain our de facto independence. So I think if this is the case, then I think between March and May, when the weather in the Taiwan Strait is suitable for larger scale military drills, China will launch a joint military exercise like the ones we have seen in last August and this April. So I think depending on those different election outcomes, China will react differently. But I think in the long run, the overall objective for the CCP is to unify with Taiwan. And so there's no fundamental differences in its attitude towards the different political parties.
Eric, I see you're nodding quite purposefully. Would you like to add any points to this answer?
Yeah, we can also see from the way that the PRC has reacted and worked with the Philippines over the last few years as a model for how they would engage with, Taiwan, irrespective of party, right? The last Filipino president was famously and quite openly pro-China. But the PRC continued with its various gray zone activities anyway, right? They were still quite aggressive, even if the Filipino president was, very conciliatory. So I'd expect to see much the same thing here. In fact, if the KMT were to win and then were to demonstrate, as Johnny mentioned, either not being open to big concessions, or if the KMT continued some of the military cooperative work with the U.S., I would actually expect to see a significant amount of backlash by the CCP, because their viewpoint would be, now we don't have any partner to discuss, anything substantive with in Taiwan. So we are going to use a stick even more. And that's essentially what we've seen in the Philippines, especially after they elected their current president right now. Right now, the entire relationship with the Philippines is all stick and no carrot.
Thank you for these answers. I'm going to read the next question that we have in the chat by Thomas Remadavicius. What is the estimate in Taipei about the cost that the regime in Beijing is prepared to bear to prevail in a war over Taiwan? What is the regime doing to prepare themselves to mitigate or avoid such potential costs? And again, I leave this open to whoever would like to answer this question. Maybe may I put Junyi in the spotlight once again?
Sure. I think it is a difficult question, because to my knowledge, I don't think both my institute or the government have made an assessment on the cost the CCP is willing to pay. But I think for me, it depends very much on how desperate the Chinese leader is. From open sources, there are messages from the Chinese officials that there might be occasions where China would launch military operations against Taiwan anyway, regardless of they can be successful or not. I think those Chinese officials were referring to a crisis, or a regime crisis for the CCP. So I think if there is deep social and economic trouble in China, and the Chinese leader, whoever he is, cannot transfer those trouble and pressure, then Taiwan will have to be a scapegoat. And in this extreme case, then I think China will want to take back Taiwan with whatever cost. But I think any scenarios other than that, I would expect the Chinese leader and the government to be rational, because I think if their regime survivability is not an issue, then the Chinese leaders will be cautious not to cause too much damage or caused on the part of the Chinese soldiers and the civilians, because that also directly relates to the regime's security. So I think it depends very much on the domestic situation in China. And it has less to do with, say, what Taiwan or other countries do.
Thank you for that. Would anyone else like to, Eric, would you like to add any point?
Sure. Well, not really argue. I'd say, yes, I agree. It's context dependent. If Taiwan were to suddenly lose its mind and declare independence, sure, I would see the Xi Jinping ordering, an invasion, regardless of the cost, right? But that's obviously not a realistic scenario. Having said that, I think depending on calculations of regime stability, I think is a weaker argument now than it was prior to February 2022, because many of these same concerns with Putin also existed in February 2022, and he chose to attack anyway. And now that we've been through all these almost 2 years of war, so and Putin is still standing despite a terrible mutiny, despite losses in tens of thousands, if not more, then I think that is probably also giving the CCP some clues as to regime stability. Right, I don't think any of them would have assessed that the Russian security regime was stronger than the CCP security regime, right? But yet, several years later, it seems like Putin is in charge more than ever. So I think there might be some dangerous ideas going around that if Putin can survive, why not us, right? So from my own perspective, yes, I would. I think it's critical for the West to see Putin defeated, and not just contained, but actually defeated in this war, because then it opens up the possibility that the CCP may decide that regime stability is not such a big deal after all.
Yeah, certainly. Well, we're closely approaching to the end of our webinar. I would like, unless there's any other question that the audience would like to raise, I would like to invite for each of the presenters to share your closing remarks, but especially to share what do you think, because we've been talking about kind of Estonia and Europe and Taiwan. What can we do from two ends? What would seem two ends of the world? What can we do to cooperate to enhance our security situation together? Thinking about Europe and Estonia and Taiwan. Let's start with this question with Tony, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. I mean, I guess fundamentally, we as Western democracies face these challenges together of authoritarianism and those threats to our security. Probably in terms of physical cooperation, there's not much to be had, but certainly sharing lessons and talking to each other and supporting each other in international fora is a very good start. And actually on that, sort of my closing remark, I mean, I focused very much on military deterrence in my presentation, but I very much welcome Eric's and Yunyi's focus on collective defense. Sorry, comprehensive defense. And I think this might be a blind spot in our approach. We obviously organize our deterrence and defense in an alliance context. But the alliance, while it has a very, very strong well-practiced, well-organized military defense, doesn't have a similar approach to comprehensive defense. NATO is quite quite specific and quite clear that resilience and comprehensive defence is basically a national issue rather than an alliance issue. And maybe we need to do a little bit more about collectivizing our response to those hybrid threats as well. So, gentlemen, I thank you for raising that issue in this webinar.
Eric?
I say this has been an excellent conversation, especially because it helps my thinking about the globalization of defense affairs, especially, in respect to Taiwan. With Taiwan's case, much of their defense thinking has been built along the partnership with the United States, right? The military ideas, but the U.S. has at its very core an expeditionary military, right? It's not really focused so much on, the defense of the homeland per se. So Estonia, I think, would have a lot of lessons for Taiwan in terms of overall civilian defense reform, right? Thinking about how civilians are not just civilian readiness, but actual civil defense. And then conversely, I think Taiwan, with its high-tech industry, also has a lot of lessons for Estonia as well as Europe in terms of how to defend against cyber threats. With the sophistication of the CCP propaganda campaign, and especially with China and Russia working more closely together these days on gray zone warfare approaches, I think it's critical for Eastern Europe and Taiwan to also work more closely together on, if not collective defense, then at least collective ideas on defense.
Thank you. Yunyi?
Yes, I think when it comes to military security, the role of, the prospect of Taiwan, Estonia, or Taiwan EU or Taiwan Europe cooperation is very limited because of the distance, so to speak. But I think what is common, both Taiwan, Estonia, and many other EU member states all confront hybrid threats from various fronts. So I think these are the common challenges we are facing. So I agree very much with Tony that this can be an issue for us to work on. And also, I think I also agreed on Eric's remarks on cooperating on the civil defense or civilian defense. I think this is what Taiwan is moving towards, but this is a very sensitive and difficult challenge for any government. So we do need to look to the experiences of other countries, and in this regard, I think the Baltic countries' experiences are very valuable for us. And finally, I think correct me if I'm wrong. I think the Baltic countries adopt a so-called value-based foreign policy, right? Or is it only confined to Lithuania? For all the Baltic countries, right? So I think as small states putting forth value-based foreign policy is in itself very encouraging, and I think there's much space to explore in this area, and I think for Taiwan, we certainly want to see other successful stories of small states promoting value-based foreign policy, and I think vice versa. So, but I haven't thought about any concrete example or issue where both can work on.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your closing remarks for this absolutely fascinating and very substantial discussion. I will just share a few thoughts to summarize our discussion. We touched on the threats that our regions and countries face. We saw the limits of hybrid warfare and its possibilities, and especially the idea of breaking the resistance and the will to fight of component. When it comes to deterrence, we spoke about the role of alliances, of comprehensive defense, the role of capabilities, of social cohesion, and all of these different elements that bring about the success of deterrence. And when it comes to lessons, we've touched on many very different actual lessons that can serve as a starting point for a larger discussion about how to enhance our security in the face of larger neighbors, in the face of hybrid warfare, in the face of challenges that we're going to face into the next year. Lessons such as reinforce deterrence, reinforce the will to fight, to rethink strategic ambiguity, and I would say to take seriously the threat and the menaces that are issued by those authoritarian regimes throughout the world. We spoke about China and Russia, but there's many more that can be added, and that to take seriously this as a threat to our security and our collective security and an international order that sustains it. So thank you very much again to our panelists. Thank you so much to our audience. I wish you a very good evening or good day wherever you are, and until next time.